Well, hi there. What's it been, 2 years?
Been 2 years, Jason.
You look great. You haven't aged a day. Not sure what to say
Tara
about that.
will do that for you.
I'm a bad liar. So we're here to talk about the question we probably get more often than any other question, spray coverage. Ultimately, it's what we always end up talking about. It's what we want to achieve when we spray. Get good coverage. Coverage is king, right?
Absolutely. And getting good coverage is a really important prerequisite to the operation of any of our materials, right?
So why are we still employed? When someone says, what do I need for getting good coverage? Why don't we say you need this, this, and this, and that's the objective?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, let's start with our target. I mean, the leaf is really the main target of most of our agricultural sprays. So in many cases, we are looking at a weed plant. We might be looking at a crop plant for fungicides. What else might we be looking at?
We could be looking at maybe corn silks if you want to get a little crazy, or we could be looking at cotyledons. We could be looking at little buds, or even in my horticultural practices, we could be looking at flowers. But you're right, predominantly it's leaves.
It's the leaf, and so the behavior of a pesticide on the leaf really depends on the kind of mode of action that we have. Let's talk about herbicides, for example. Some herbicides are purely contact. They simply have to sit on the top of the cuticle, and then they will penetrate through that cuticle and kill the cells that are underneath it directly. But some are translocated and are systemic, and they would have to go not only through the cuticle but also the epidermis, and ultimately end up in the cytoplasm, I think it's called, the living part of the cell that translocates to other parts.
Well, why? I mean, why would we want it inside the plant? For like a sucking insect that sucks it back out, or maybe to get it to a different place in the plant?
That's also true. So the herbicides might have to move to the apical meristems. They might have to move to another part of the plant, and they have to be in the symplast, the cytoplasm, living part of the cell, to do that, sort of the source to sink kind of movement. But in some cases, an insect might feed on the leaf, and so the pesticide that we apply to kill that insect, or the insect might eat the leaf, would have to be in the leaf tissue itself and not translocate too far away from it.
I suppose there are also those applications where if it gets onto the earth itself for like a pre-emerge, we want it to get drawn up by roots and move through the xylem or the apoplasm, or sort of the so-called dead space in the plant to the growing tips.
Yeah, absolutely. So in all cases, any real mode of action, be it a herbicide or even a fungicide or insecticide, ultimately it's going to have to deal with moving into a plant surface and or landing on a plant surface and ultimately moving through that plant in some fashion.
So as we start talking about coverage, I think what I hear you saying is it kind of depends on what we want this chemistry to do or how it's meant to behave once it arrives at the target.
That's right. So the question really is, what's the journey like?
And that's a great question. So when we talk about spraying, when the grower has made their decision about when to spray, what to spray, how to spray, they've considered the environment, they've done their IPM, everything's set, and they spray, they release these droplets into the wild. And what happens from that point is sort of the journey of the droplet.
That's right. It's a fairly complicated journey.
Yeah, and I like to break it up into two sections. There's sort of the transfer of the droplet to the target, and then there's the reception of that target. So it's kind of a spectrum. The droplet gets to the target and what happens when it reaches it. So let's just break it down real quick. The spray liquid is atomized or turned into a series of small droplets released from the nozzle, and they travel from A to B to the target. Now, a lot of things can happen to the droplet on the way to that target. Maybe wind blows them off course, maybe they shoot there like lasers, maybe they evaporate, right? We don't know. But at some point, they get from A to B, they arrive at the target. Once they get there, they have to hit it. That's impaction or impingement. So the droplet actually lands on the leaf like the one you showed, and then what happens? Maybe in the case of larger droplets, they bounce, or they run off, or they shatter into a bunch of smaller pieces, and those pieces land. Or in the case of maybe a finer droplet, and we'll get into this distinction, the finers are more likely to land and stay where they landed. They're really good for getting coverage that way. In either case, once they do land, they form a deposit. So the bigger droplets will sit in one spot and slowly evaporate and form, well, think of it like a plaque. Their active ingredient forms a layer on the outside, where the finer droplets maybe evaporate really quickly and leave little deposits behind. And this is important because of what you mentioned, how the mode of action works. The longer they stay wet on that surface, let's say for something that's taken up by the plant, the more likely we have a gradient, a concentration gradient, that allows that active ingredient to travel inside the plant and eventually move through the vascularity or not. In fact, the fine droplets, which form these little residues, dry so quickly, they may not even be biologically active after a while. And that kind of leads us from where it left the nozzle to where it lands on the target, hopefully, and then still has the impact that we want.
That's right. And so the question we often get is, what's the ideal droplet size? And so, we talk about coarse droplets or fine droplets, and we get all kinds of theories about whether it's more efficient to spray with a smaller droplet to get obviously more coverage, but some of the downsides. So what are really the pros and cons, I guess, of each individual droplet size? Let's start with a fairly large droplet. This would be an extremely coarse droplet, very low drift. It is able to actually drag air along with it behind it, actually drag small droplets with it. They go along for a free ride. Very long drying time, so that driving force you talked about, that uptake potential is very high in these larger droplets. In fact, glyphosate is taken up more efficiently by larger droplets than smaller droplets. So that's one of the reasons coarse droplets work quite well with glyphosate. But unfortunately, high rebound and very low coverage. When we go to a more intermediate sized droplet, this would be a coarse spray quality. We still have relatively low drift. We have modest kind of air entrainment, modest coverage. Everything's kind of in the middle. It's a bit of a compromise spray. Does a few things sort of well, but none of them really exceptionally well. We get a little bit smaller. This would be a medium spray quality. We still have a fair number of fair bit of drift now because they're getting smaller. We have a fair number of droplets, so we have good coverage and sort of faster drying times, maybe less uptake as a result of that for some active ingredients that require the liquid. When we get to the very small droplets, now these are the fine sprays. There's certainly a lot of them. By the way, all of these droplets here are numerically equivalent in volume. So the single one large 600 micron drop is the same volume as the 5 350, the 20 or so.
You measured all these when you did this?
I counted them when I made them. Yeah. So
you're an exciting fellow.
Yeah, that's how I spend my afternoons.
Wow.
Counting droplets. These droplets are kind of the darling of coverage aficionados, but they do have problems. Of course, they drift. They have very high evaporation rates. They actually have a relatively low ability to really help any other droplet out. They have low entrainment and so on and so forth. So we think maybe the droplets on the left side have a few disadvantages, maybe a few more disadvantages than the droplets on the right side of the screen.
Cool. So this is a nozzle, what would you say, very coarse? Coarse at least. Certainly a big droplet.
It's a
right?
typical air-induced tip. I think I see this as an agri-top or a greenleaf turbo drop.
Yep.
So I think it would be very coarse to extremely coarse, actually.
And it's neat here. So when you showed how all the different droplets behave, or how they have potential for coverage, potential for retention, potential to actually arrive at the target, we see here with these large droplets how they move ballistically. And by that I mean a coarser droplet tends to move in a straight line. It doesn't tend to get deflected by wind or travel speed or wakes behind the sprayer, let's say. You can kind of aim them. In the case of a directed application, if you were to aim that nozzle a little differently, that's the direction the spray would go in. So they move in a straight line, high velocity, and when they come in contact with anything, game over. That's the end of the journey.
And sort of the angling you just mentioned is sort of like the forward angle we like to put on Fusarium head blight, for example, when we have to hit a vertical target and it's best to come in from the angle.
Right.
It's the larger droplets that are able to actually do that quite well.
Right, and that's how we take advantage of the predictability of a coarser droplet. But once again, when it does hit a target, coverage may not be great because it doesn't get retained. It could roll off, it could shatter, it could bounce. Now, in this case, we have medium coarse nozzle. And what's really neat to see about this is that a single nozzle puts out a range of droplet sizes. It's very clear from this image. To the left and the right on the spray, we call these the horns, you can see the coarser droplets. You can see how fast those are moving. And they're moving in a straight line. Towards the center of the swath, and watch now as this repeats, you can see the coarser droplets on the outside hit the target. When the inside of the spray gets maybe halfway, they move so much slower. And why does that matter? Because it takes so long for them to arrive at the target that they have more opportunity to evaporate, to be blown off course, to move unpredictably.
So why do the little droplets drift? What's the problem?
Well, they have very little mass, don't they? So gravity doesn't grab them the same way, and nor does velocity affect them the same way. It takes a lot more pressure to cause a fine droplet to move faster than it does something with mass. And we've done this demonstration. If you throw a golf ball gently and pretend it's a coarse droplet, you can predict the way it's going to move. And if you throw it even harder, well, it's going to react. It's going to fly faster and further. But with a finer droplet, let's say a feather, you can throw it gently and it's going to flutter and do whatever it wants. Then you can throw it as hard as you want to try to get it to go faster. And quite often, it's not going to go very much further or faster at all. It's still going to slow very quickly and then drift and flutter all over the place.
But a small drop could drift less if you were able to keep it going fast for a longer time, right?
Yeah. So there are ways that we can give a little direction to the wayward droplet that is the fine. And how could we direct it? Well, we could use air entrainment. Now, in my world, and I say that I play both sides of the fence. I'll do specialty crops. I'll also work with field crops. And in specialty crops, we will use air assist quite often. You'll see in air blast sprayers. That is how we impart force and direction onto a fine. Instead of letting it go willy-nilly, we can aim it using that air and carry it somewhat reliably to the target. Yes, it will still evaporate, but we can get it from A to B more reliably that way. Okay. And there are other ways you can do it too. We mentioned earlier a directed application. Perhaps you want to get the nozzle closer to the target and aim up from underneath. You reduce that distance from A to B, so it doesn't have quite as much opportunity to evaporate or be blown off course. But we can see that they do different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a very good example of how they do different things. This is a fairly coarse spray coming in on a leaf. It's a pubescent leaf. You see the little trichome sticking out. And there's a couple of different things happening here. For example, you see some of the larger drops in the center of the image that are making excellent contact with the leaf surface. It's their momentum, their weight, that has caused them to come into contact. And some of the smaller drops arriving a little later are actually stuck at the ends of trichomes. And they actually are making zero contact with the leaf surface. So even though they have potential for coverage, they're actually not able to do it because they can't get to where they need to be.
So this, we can play two different cards on this particular hand. We can talk about the biological activity that you mentioned earlier. If they end up on the trichomes and then slowly start to dry out and evaporate, they don't splash down onto the surface of the leaf. They just sort of reduce to nothing right on the tip of the trichome. And I've seen video out of Ohio State, Dr. Herping Zoo, who takes these videos, these wonderful videos of the droplet just shrinking in place. And you can actually imagine an insect walking right underneath and never touching it. And the trichomes are dead tissue, really, they're hollow cells. So there's no real biological imperative for any of that active to be taken up by the trichome into the plant. You hit it, but you kind of missed. At the same time, those great big droplets that land stay wet longer, and they give you that advantage that you're going to have that concentration gradient. It is going to be taken up longer.
Or if an insect were to walk over that leaf surface, it would probably drag its hind feet through that wet deposit and therefore have that product taken up.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So let's look at it a different way. Let's look at, again, the spread factor now, sort of the impact of the large droplet on the leaf surface. Large droplets, because they're coming in fast and because they have a lot of mass, they actually spread out more after they form. And as you get to smaller and smaller droplets, the spread factor is less and less. But ultimately, when you look at all of these four different scenarios, again, the two worst case on the left side and the two best case on the right side of the image, you see that the actual surface area covered by all of them, when you consider their different spread factors, is actually quite similar, which is a bit of a surprise. We always think less coverage with a large drop, but actually once it's spread out, it's not that bad.
True, true. But of course, you know, just to play devil's advocate, we do have to talk about retention here. So if it hits, does it stay? I love this video, by the way. I could just sit here and it's like a lava lamp.
Let's watch it for a few minutes.
You know, that's it. We're going to check out for 5. Everybody can watch this with us. This is a beautiful video. It shows how you hit it, and yet you kind of didn't. If this leaf weren't horizontal, if it were, say, vertical, we'll call that hard to wet, all of this would have simply washed right off. Now, as it stands, some of it did stay behind, and that's great. In fact, it shattered, as air induction nozzles, those droplets are said to do, and that explosion has actually created a number of very small droplets that bounce unpredictably. My predecessor, Helmut Spicer, had a wonderful video of a droplet ricocheting 8 times before it finally settled and leaving a little bit of itself behind. And if only we could actually cause that to happen rather than just sort of reap the benefit of it happening by serendipity. If I could control bounce, I wouldn't be working here. It'd be great if we could control it, wouldn't it?
But Jason, I think if you were a formulation chemist working in a lab studying this new formulation of product, you'd say, you know, we need to put something else in here. We have to prevent this kind of behavior. In the previous video, we saw larger droplets coming in and sticking just fine. They had something in it. It had a surface active agent, a surfactant, or maybe a viscosity modifying agent, something in there that helps that droplet actually make contact and not recollect itself and bounce out of the picture.
So that's already in the formulation, or on the label, of course, it says use this surfactant because that's how it's intended to
Yeah,
work.
let's call that the low-hanging fruit. I mean, there's certainly ways of making this situation that we're watching right now a little bit more positive for the outcome. And I think that in the formulation labs and right at the product where the product is manufactured, they will be looking at that and making sure that if this particular pesticide had to go on that particular leaf and it behaved like this, they would modify
Let's
that.
chase that for a second. We're seeing more and more adjuvants available. Now, the PMRA, of course, needs efficacy data before they make those available, but we are getting more and more information about adjuvants all the time. The United States is replete with a whole spectrum of adjuvants, and they don't necessarily have to prove that they do.
Well, they don't actually. The regulatory requirement doesn't require that an activator adjuvant, an adjuvant that helps a product perform better in terms of efficacy, they don't require efficacy data for that product. So in Canada, we do require that. And so for that reason, we have fewer products available because most of the adjuvant companies are actually relatively small companies.
Sure.
And so they have limited resources and they say, we can't provide that efficacy data, field trials, et cetera, too much work. So we tend to see more the utility modifier adjuvants in Canada, the ones that reduce drift by making the droplets larger, the ones that maybe modify pH, that kind of a thing.
Now, that's all true, and there is a voluntary organization in the States to try to, let's say, up the standards of certain adjuvants. They don't have to participate, but there are seals of approval. There's self-police to ensure that they, in fact, do what they say they can do, and that's good, step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But if someone in the pursuit of coverage thought, I saw a great video where I saw a droplet just spread and keep on spreading, maybe I want to add a little of that to the tank. Are there any potential downsides to that approach?
Well, it is possible that the evaporation rate will be affected by that spreading. It's possible that the driving force of uptake is affected by that amount of spread. So we may want to avoid those kinds of things. But let's move on to the next slide. And
you see how I managed to keep that on there longer? I told you I love that slide.
That's a record. Yeah. So let's kind of recap. The large droplets they come in fast, and the very strong likelihood is that they'll actually rebound and not be retained by the leaf at all. So we have to be very cautious about implementing large drops, at least without proper adjuvants or other safeguards. The intermediate size, some will probably rebound, but the majority will likely stick. So it's a bit of an intermediate situation. In the smaller droplets, most will probably stick. And then when you have the very small ones, if they do come in without drifting away, the ones that do make it will in fact also drift. But we do have some losses, and there will be some evaporation loss. So that's kind of the upshot of that example. And so I guess the real question is, so what should we do? So we've got pros and cons.
We're dancing around it a bit and talking about coverage. We thought it would be best to describe all the different things that impact coverage, everything that contributes, for better or for worse, to eventually how much spray stays on the target. And one of the things that we wanted to get across to you is that different droplets behave in different ways. And in fact, probably some blend of different droplet sizes give us the best of all worlds. As you said, we become a bit of a generalist, but we also kind of get to take advantage of all droplet sizes. But if we want to do a better job and we want to see what kind of coverage we're getting, we need a tool that's going to give us feedback. And this is water-sensitive paper, and we talk about this a lot. What's interesting about this particular slide is you can see all these volumes are the same, all these applications are the same. All we've changed here, or I should say the rates are the same, all we've changed is the droplet size.
That's right.
And you can see how that spray covers the target differently. And what I want to draw your attention to is if we try to quantify spray using water-sensitive paper, we have to use two different metrics. We have to talk about the amount of the paper or the target that receives spray, and we want to talk about how those residues, those deposits, are distributed over the target. Yeah.
So how would you define coverage? I mean, when you talk about the amount of paper that's covered by the spray, is that what coverage is?
Well, it's a moving target, right? We just described all kinds of different modes of action. We've described different biological activities. There is no one perfect level of coverage, but there is a kind of worst case standard that's I've been using and I've seen in the literature, I've seen worldwide, and that is 85 drops per square centimeter and 10 to 15% of the target covered. So consider this. Let's say we have 25% of the target covered. Sounds pretty good when I said 10 to 15 is all you need. But let's say it's just 1/4 of the paper that received that coverage. You didn't get anything in the other 3/4 of the paper. Is that good coverage? Probably not, right? The distribution is bad. But if we did redistribute those droplets and cover the paper evenly, now we can see that the percent covered And the droplet density, or the distribution of 85 drops per square centimeter, means that the likelihood that we're going to, say, hit a mobile insect, or even a sessile, say the ascospore on a fungal spore, we're going to come into contact with it. It goes up if the distribution is good. Now, do you need that for all applications? No. Certainly for something like Roundup, which you mentioned earlier, 85 drops per square centimeter doesn't make any sense at all. But for a fungicide application or a more particular spray, if you can achieve that, you've probably done a good job.
Exactly. Okay, so we're talking now about, you saw the paper, and the paper had these symbols on top of it. I'll just go back to it real quick. VF and F is very fine to fine, FM is fine to medium, MC is medium to coarse, C and VC is coarse to very coarse, VC to XC is very coarse to extremely coarse, and finally extremely coarse to ultra coarse.
Ultra coarse.
And when a producer purchases a nozzle, we do classify the spray that they produce according to those very same categories. These are international categories, and we typically are targeting a spray that'll likely be in the medium to coarse category for most herbicides. In some cases, we'll go to very coarse sprays for extra drift control. But we do have this special category down here, the extremely coarse to ultra coarse. What on earth could that be for?
And that's designed to drive me crazy. The extremely coarse to ultra coarse, you'd think it wouldn't work. You know, it's the equivalent of 1 drop per square foot to my mind sometimes. But there are certain pesticides, dicamba, for example, where the label requires an ultra coarse droplet size. And the only reason you would go that big is to prevent off-target drift. That's it. They're so big, we can predict with such reliability that these are going to move in a straight line, and when they get to the target, their journey's done. We've gone to the point where maybe we've even backed away from good coverage in our attempt to keep it on target. Can you think of a reason beyond the label that maybe that's a tool in our toolbox?
Well, one thing I was just thinking of is that you know, they are a powerful tool if you're committed to a job and the weather changes, for example, and you have no recourse. So, for example, let's imagine that you've got a field that's maybe 10 or 15 miles away from the yard. You've just trailered your sprayer out there. You've got your tender truck there. You're going to do that job, but local conditions are different and the wind is higher than you anticipated.
You pack it in, you drive home.
Of course, and you just try it again and again and again until finally you get the job done. Because,
good job.
Well, what else could you be doing?
Honestly.
Probably. The point is, and if you have a dicamba nozzle at the ready, you can probably make a small adjustment to your water volume, maybe your spray pressure, and get the job done safely. You can spray with an extremely coarse spray under relatively windy conditions without causing an unnecessary amount of drift. You may lose some coverage, that's true. You can modify that with perhaps, as I said, the water volume, but you'll get the job done. And getting the job done is perhaps every bit as important as protecting the environment in that case. And I think we're achieving both tasks.
I like it.
Great. What are the tools that are available for measuring coverage, Jason?
So we like water-sensitive paper. We can use any number of tools. There are dyes, fluorescent dyes, recovery products, stuff that no grower is going to use because it's complicated, it takes a lot of time, and really you need some training to figure it out. Water-sensitive paper, while it isn't perfect, is immediate feedback, and you're able to compare a before and after. I sprayed under these settings, I got this. I made one change, now I see this. So you can see whether that change is positive or negative. You can put it in places that are perhaps difficult to reach. In our discussion of coverage, we're still talking about a single leaf, one plane, and we're describing it as being in line of sight of the droplet, or the nozzle, I should say. But if we have a very dense canopy or some snarly canopy, we're asking a droplet to circumnavigate around all those different obstacles to get to the inside. Fines do it pretty well if you help them. Coarse, maybe not quite so well. Volume helps, we've talked about that. But how do you know if you did it? You put a piece of water-sensitive paper in there.
Where can you get the stuff?
Well, now, 50 years after Syngenta commercialized it, several places. Water-sensitive paper is now available. It's made in the States. It's called Spot On. And just last year, from Brazil, this WS paper brand came up. And on Sprayers 101, shameless plug, we did a comparison of these three and looked at what they were able to resolve and their ease of use, and frankly, they're all great. They all work super duper. If you're a researcher, maybe the story is different, but for a grower, get a bag of this stuff, take 5 seconds, spray, look what the coverage looks like, make your change, see if you've made things better or worse. I recommend having this with you at all times. Having said that, there are limitations. Whatever you see on the water-sensitive paper will be a worst-case scenario. No paper will reliably resolve any spray under 50 microns. Some companies say 100. Now, to your point, Tom, Nozzles do produce a variety of droplet sizes, and I think we've said we like the fact that the fines do one thing and the coarse do another. Just because you can't see the finest droplets doesn't mean they're not actually on the paper. It just doesn't resolve them. And it's paper. You know, it's not a biological surface. It's not a leaf. It's not a fruit. It's not a flower. So here, this work was done by Robin Gaskin out of New Zealand. This is a fluorescent dye on a leaf. These are the exact same droplets on a leaf as they are on water-sensitive paper. Look at the spread. This is an organosilicone spreader, super spreader, and you can see how much surface area was covered, but the super spreader didn't show any difference at all on water-sensitive paper. So really, whenever you do look at the papers, take it with just a grain of salt. Do your counts, 85 drops per square centimeter. Take a look to make sure you've got 10 to 15% coverage, and understand that they probably spread better. How do we know our percent coverage, though? I can count, but how do we do the rest?
Well, there are, I guess, so we used to use a scanner, a flatbed scanner in the lab. We would expose the papers in the field, and for trials, we would bring them in, carefully have them labeled, and then we would...
Just like every grower with the flatbed scanner in the cab.
We have a flatbed scanner.
Sure.
You lay them all out, and the wind doesn't blow them off, and you scan them, and then you individually analyze them on specialized software that we have for
Who doesn't
purposes.
have that?
Of course. I mean, I expect everybody to have that. But what else do we have here? Well, you have Snapcard, I think, is an app that we've both used. Tell me about it?
Well, it's out of Australia, and it's on your smartphone, and it's a pretty keen app. And we've compared it to more reliable methods. All you do is take a photograph of the water-sensitive paper, and you just drag a little reticle window around the outside, and it tells you the percent of that target that's received spray. Unfortunately, and as we've discussed, there are two metrics for coverage: the percent coverage and the droplet density. It doesn't do droplet density.
So, but we can still do that visually and have sort of gauge our own eyes to sort of have an assessment.
All
of that
those water-sensitive papers come with a little cardboard cutout with a 1 centimeter square plug cut out of it. And you just lay it on the card, you do a count. And if you've got crummy eyes like mine, you use the actual full centimeter. If you've got better eyes, you can use the half centimeter and count faster and double it up. But the point is, with a little experience, just a little practice, you can use Snapcard in a quick count, and you know very quickly.
It's an app. You take a picture of the water-sensitive paper, you crop it to the size you want, and bingo.
It's free, and it keeps a record, a spray record for you. So you can look back and go, hey, that worked great. Wonder what my coverage looked like, or vice versa.
Snapcard, developed by GRDC in Australia. Another one that we've used is called Dropscope. So this one has an integrated scanner, and it works off a smartphone with Bluetooth or cabled on a laptop. And it does a much better job of analyzing sort of the fine little details if we want to get to there.
Yeah, this would be great for a crop consultant. I don't see every grower running out and buying this, but I've tested this. I know you've tested this, and it's a really sophisticated system. I think it's really smart how it does what it does. It does it quickly, and it does it accurately. And if you really want to delve into coverage, this is a fantastic tool.
Well, that's fantastic. I guess we really need to just really show people what we think the best possible droplet size could be.
Yeah, I think we need to sum this up. How come you're wearing a lab coat over there?
Well, I'm always ready to do some experimentation.
Well, why don't we just do that?
All right, let's do it.
Is this considered obscene for OAGC? Now we come to the live portion of the demo, because if we aren't dumping stuff all over, it's not fun. We have 3 volumes of spray. Imagine this is the nozzle. All 3 buckets are filled with droplets. Very coarse droplets, medium droplets, and we'll say very fine droplets. Now, normally when we're spraying, if this is the nozzle and it starts spraying, I'm the one running back and forth over the target, but we can't manage that in here. Instead, we're going to have the target run under the nozzle. So we're going to show what happens when very coarse droplets are applied to a vertical target. Are you ready to show us target? Toro. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 spray, and you're going to charge, and we're going to see what sticks. Okay. 1, 2, 3, spray. Come on back, let's see what stuck to the target. I don't think I'd be happy if I was a grower and saw this. So the very large droplets, as we talked about earlier, they didn't adhere to a vertical target. We'll say Tom is not a wettable target. They bounced, they went all over the place, but they did fall straight down. They did move predictably. They even bounced when they got to the ground. But they didn't stick. Would we ever use such big droplets on a vertical target?
Maybe for a horizontal target, like a soybean leaf.
I like that.
Or a pigweed leaf.
Or even just a pre-emerge if you were soil instead of a leaf. How about we try this again?
Sure, let's try it again.
Okay. Now we're going to try this again. These are the same very coarse droplets, but this time on a sessile target or perhaps pre-emerge. Let's see what happens. Wow, you make a fantastic target. Why don't you climb on up here and we'll see what we got. Hey. Slippery, isn't it? So this time, they did bounce, they did roll away, they did move predictably, but because he wasn't a hard-to-hit target, he was a sessile target, maybe a pre-emerge or a very small weed, we got a hit. They stuck, even though they were that big. Okay, we've done very coarse for a vertical target and a horizontal target. It's time to go down to the medium droplets. Remember, smaller, more of them. We've kept the same volume, so we're not spraying any more spray liquid. We've just broken it into smaller pieces. We'll go 1, 2, 3 spray, and we'll see what happens for coverage this time, shall we? Toro, 1, 2, 3, spray. Wow. Well, I'd say we have a greater droplet density. I'll say we have more percent area covered. But if you noticed, we also missed an awful lot. They went to a lot of places. Not so small that they weren't predictable, but so many of them, some did actually drift off course and go places we didn't predict. In fact, I suspect we'll be cleaning this up for some time. Would you say that's good coverage?
That's good coverage.
So we can see the benefit of going to smaller droplets.
Absolutely. So we've done the coarse and the medium sprays, and we saw that the coarse really had no retention on the vertical target and some retention on the horizontal target. The medium sprays were intermediate. They had some retention on the vertical target and had decent coverage. Now we'll use a fine spray, very small droplets. Jason will be our target, and we'll see where they stick. So Jason, are you ready?
I think so.
We're going to go on 1, 2, 3, spray. Are you ready?
Yep.
1, 2, 3, spray.
Oh.
Wow. I have to say that worked better than expected. So we have, what do we see here? We have coverage on the front. Oh, we have coverage on your head. Where else have we got it? Your eyelashes a little bit maybe?
The worst
on your
dandruff
neck.
problem in the world.
Maybe do a turn. Even on the back. So
really?
Sometimes the small droplets in the wake of a spray will wrap around the back. If they're small enough, they can change direction very quickly. So this is good for canopy penetration, underleaf coverage, drift.
Well, speaking of drift, it went everywhere. How much do you think actually impinged on me?
That's a good point. So we probably got maybe a fraction, some small fraction, maybe a quarter, maybe something. It's hard to tell from this.
So if we could control this better, maybe air assist to create the vortices on purpose that wrapped around behind me. I've even heard electrostatics, although I'm still learning about those, to be honest. Anything to direct a fine to its target would be a good thing. Certainly we got good coverage, but at the expense of a lot of misses.
Yeah, so this is great. So we've demonstrated coarse droplets don't stick to vertical targets, but they might stick to horizontal targets. Intermediate sprays stuck not too badly, actually, and the fine spray stuck best of all, but there was a problem getting them to the target. Well, all right, that's it for the demonstration part of our presentation. Hopefully, you've understood some principles of the right spray for the conditions and the concept of coverage. Obviously, I think in agriculture, Jason, maybe I'll step down from the chair. Maybe
no,
we can
I think I've got one last thing to share. So now that we're covered with styrofoam, let's just hit some take-home messages. Tom, if someone asked you about coverage, how would you sum all this up?
Well, coverage is important. The spray quality matters, and I think that there's a role to play for large and small droplets, and that's why I like the intermediate spray qualities for covering kind of both bases. A little bit of the small droplets for the difficult to reach places, but not too many for drift, and more of the larger droplets for slower evaporation, better drift control. So the intermediate spray qualities like medium coarse, very coarse, that's our sweet spot. Most air-induced middle-of-the-range nozzles at intermediate pressures can achieve that. And the second takeaway, Jason, for me is that there's really a diminishing return to exceeding the minimum amount of coverage. Once you've got the coverage decent, and it's really as depicted in these images here, putting more on doesn't really give you better results necessarily. You're really now just starting to waste resources like water volume. Jason, what about you? What are your takeaways?
I'm going to lean on the image itself. There's no way for us to know what kind of coverage we have unless we have a record of it. So I highly recommend that growers buy water-sensitive paper. It really isn't very expensive. Get used to using it. Leave the cab for a minute, spray, and go back, collect, and check it. Because that way you begin to understand what coverage will give you what kind of a result. If you're perfectly happy with your disease control, if you're perfectly happy with how well you're controlling your weeds, see what the water sensitive paper says. See what kind of spray coverage you need to achieve that. And the reciprocal of that, if you're not getting control, if you don't like the results you're getting, you've got the water sensitive paper to show you what coverage wasn't sufficient. Don't be afraid to make a change, improve your coverage, and then watch those results. After a little while, it becomes second nature, and you'll begin to understand when you make changes to your sprayer or those parameters, how it will affect coverage and how that'll affect your job. And of course, if you're going to do this, wear a hat. I have enough styrofoam buried in the depths of my hair right now to run a craft show for 5 years. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Wow. Doctors Tom and Jason. I don't know where you guys got your doctorates from, but maybe Dr. Doolittle's college. But anyhow, that was awesome. Hard to call it a presentation. That was more a demonstration. And boy, we would love to see the outtakes of what went wrong on those. But great stuff. We do have some questions coming in, and keep them coming in the chat. And I'll fire them to you. First question, simple one, probably right off the bat. Earlier in the presentation, you had the video showing the droplets coming down, and it looked like the droplets were, you used the word horns. They were going to each side, nothing in the middle. So is that just what we're seeing in the lighting, or are you counting on the next nozzle to be picking that up, that overlap? How does that work in terms of the nozzles from what we saw there on the video?
Thanks, Andrew. And you wouldn't have wanted to see those outtakes. It took 40 minutes just to get all that styrofoam out of my ears, and we'll leave that as the only orifice I'll mention. You're right. That video with the nozzle, it was a little difficult to see. There are coarser droplets naturally in every flat fan nozzle towards the outside, the horns, and finer to the center. That's why it's so important we have 100% overlap. So it's heterogeneous. I can never say that word. You end up with coarses and fines evenly throughout the swath. So I think it was just a bit of an artifact that it was hard to see on screen.
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, we have a laser. We had a laser in our lab, and we have measured not just the volume, which is on all flat fan nozzles, it's tapered. So the majority of the spray volume is in the center, and it tapers out to less and less towards the edges. And that is, in fact, the reason that we require an overlap to cover off those tapered regions.
I tried to make it.
But when we measure
like a bird's mouth
number, we see the largest number of small droplets in the center, and the video didn't show that because of the lighting conditions, unfortunately. But the largest number of small droplets are in the center, and the so-called horns, as Jason called them, contain almost no small droplets. And so we actually need overlap for that reason as well. So we need to get the small droplets throughout the entire width of the pattern, and the adjacent nozzle is the one that actually does that for you as well.
Right on. Here's a question. Dave Hooker is wondering that if an adjuvant reduces surface tension, the large droplets, would they explode more, as in the video?
I've never seen them explode more. With a loss of surface tension, yeah, they should lose cohesion and bounce away. But mostly what happens is it's sort of the hydrophobic, hydrophilic argument. They become less water-loving and more fat-loving. They want to cling to a waxy surface. So they do blow apart, yes, but they also spread. Tom, have you ever seen slow motion video of the droplets exploding more violently with a spreader in them?
I don't know. I think it's because the physical-chemical properties of liquids elicit such a wide variety of responses depending on their own characteristics, but also the characteristics of the surface that they impinge on. We have seen a lot of different things. Jason in the presentation mentioned Dr. Herping Zhu at Ohio State. And I actually studied there and got to know Herping a little bit and worked in his lab somewhat. And they do have some very cool high-speed video. And I myself took some high-speed video of droplets impinging on leaves and on straw surfaces. And we saw a number of different things. But the one thing that the surfactants always did was they just, when the drop impacts, it spreads out. Without any surfactant, the water droplet wants to come back together. And sort of it then has a very elastic nature and just wants to come, well, it's inelastic actually, doesn't want to stay broad and come back together. And that causes that release. With the surfactant, it's able to make better initial contact on the leaf surface and therefore transfers its energy to that surface. And that's one of the reasons when it spreads out, it actually stays adhering to that surface it's spread out on and is much less likely to come back together and bounce off. Now, those factors very likely will also influence the integrity of the droplet. But one thing we have seen is, of course, with the air induction tips, there is high-speed video evidence that the air pockets in those droplets can create some kind of explosion. But I would say it's a relatively rare. The video that we showed with a one big drop coming in the leaf and exploding violently on impact, that's a very large drop on a very difficult to wet surface. It was for visual impact, a teaching tool, but very rare to see that kind of violence in a real small drop.
It's funny, you should mention that elasticity of the droplet. It's a conservation of energy, right? It explodes back out. It always reminded me of pizza dough. For anyone that's ever tried to make their own dough, if you don't let it rest long enough and stretch it out, it just goes right back into its original shape. So that spreading factor, the resting of dough, is almost like the hydrophobicity of, or the lower surface tension. You mentioned the air droplets. I've always thought of them as shock absorbers. So you read all the advertisements back in the day when air induction came out, and it said these little pockets of air cause that explosion and you get more coverage. But the more I study about them, the more I see that they prevent the droplet from, it's less likely to bounce away on impact. And that's as much mass and velocity.
That's a great point, Jason. Thanks for reminding me. We did once do a study where we matched spray qualities of air-induced and non-air-induced sprays and tested them side by side just to see what the effect of that air induction is. And it does have an effect. And we noticed, for example, that in approximately, we used sort of a coarse spray, and we can't do it droplet by droplet size, really. It's not that exact, but we did notice that with air induction, we did tend to have slightly better retention on some of the more difficult to wet surfaces. It was a 5 or 10% increase in retention. It wasn't a make or break situation, but we did feel that under some conditions, air induction does do exactly as advertised. It allows the larger drops to adhere slightly better. We've kind of moved away from that messaging, though. We haven't emphasized it because it's a small effect, and we don't really want to stand in the way of people using other types of nozzles as well for drift reducing, particularly for PWM, where we can't use air induction. So, we've made a strategic decision to sort of downplay that small difference, because I think in practical terms, I don't think it would show up on a farmer's field. And I don't want to stand in the way of the adoption of a PWM technology where that kind of technology wouldn't be possible. It's relatively minor, in my opinion.
Right on. Okay, lots of questions coming in here, guys. So I'll keep firing them at you. John is asking, and in his hoser way, he said, "Whatever happened to electrostatic spraying?"
Oh.
Eh?
I didn't get a charge out of it. I don't know what happened. I just lost interest. I wasn't attracted to it.
Oh my God.
Well, we better move on to the next one here. Brandon's asking about using a combination of medium and small droplet sizes to improve contact and reduce loss. And in the chat, Brad kind of chipped in as well and said some new sprayer technology lets you use 2 different nozzles per nozzle body. That can work for some applications. But any other comments on the combination, medium and small?
Well, I would counter that and say, how small, how hot is it, how dry is it? Small is a relative term here, but without some means to control where those fines are going, I'd say beware. The further away from the target, the hotter it is, the drier it is, the less likely they're all going to arrive. And what we talked about earlier is once they do impinge, if you're lucky enough to hit it, if they dry instantly, depending on the mode of action, they may not have any biological relevancy anyway. So, and I'm going to leave for Tom to talk about this because he's seen the study, but there's some neat work. I don't know if it's theoretical or if they've actually proven it, that large droplets create a kind of a wake behind themselves. And think of the wake behind a boat. And they will entrain and pull smaller droplets in behind them, almost like a football blocker covering the guy with the ball. So when you have a mixture of larger and smaller droplets, they kind of each play to their strength. The large droplet gets them to the target, and once it hits, the fines are sort of released to travel around and move in unpredictable ways and even hit stems and underleaf. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, you're talking about a study that we did at Ohio State, actually, and Dr. Andrew Chappell, who was a student there at the same time I was, he's now at Bayer Crop Science in Monheim, Germany, invented a system where he thought, well, the small drops are highly efficacious for targeting, say, small insects or other kind of where small droplets clearly have an efficacy advantage. But the large drops do create this downward flow. They actually draw air, as you said, the entrainment effect. So what we did is we developed a system where a large nozzle carried just water and sprayed coarse droplets. And then a small nozzle injected its spray into that entrained stream. We measured whether the droplets would actually coalesce and form a single drop, a diluted drop, and they didn't. The stream stayed fairly discrete, but the large drop stream here helped the small drop stream deposit. And we did show that drift was significantly reduced with this system compared to a single small nozzle. And efficacy was also enhanced because the active ingredient was delivered in the appropriate droplet size. This air entrainment effect is one of the reasons I actually like coarse droplets, because they may still carry small droplets. These coarse sprays all have small droplets in them, but the small droplets are protected from drift by associating themselves with that entrainment effect. It's a powerful and present effect. Yeah.
That entrainment concept, with a lot of the crops I work with, I use air in the place of coarse droplets. That way you don't have to carry more water, and you don't have to worry about a bad distribution of active ingredient. You're not using the courses as a mechanism and wasting AI while you're doing it. But I'll jump in for people who haven't asked the question. Tom, there was something about using two nozzles, let's say one medium and one fine. Don't you feel that the variety in a single nozzle is sufficient variety in droplet size, that we don't need to worry about two nozzles in one position?
Yeah, I agree with you on that one, Jason. I think that there are ways, of course, that we can expand what we call the span of the droplet size spectrum. So, like the questioner asked, a small drop or a fine spray and a very coarse spray together would create a huge span. But I don't know. I don't think we have actually done that work that we can say it's better or not better. But I agree with you. All sprays, be they fine or medium or coarse or extremely coarse, contain both small and large droplets. They're all heterogeneous by nature. Flat fan hydraulic nozzles produce those kinds of sprays. And it depends a little bit to how wide that range is, but it's present, and we get the advantage of all of them.
Okay, Brian is asking, what are the thoughts on 10-inch nozzle spacing versus 20-inch for mitigation of off-target movement? And Brad chips in to add to it, and he says, what's the ideal nozzle spacing for row crop application, 10-inch, 15-inch, or 20-inch?
Hey, Tom, aren't you writing an article on this right now?
Yeah, I'm actually drafting an article on this very topic, and the question originates really from a new sprayer, which is essentially, let's go back up. If you have 10-inch spacing, of course, you can lower your boom. Let's talk about minimum overlaps. Of a 110-degree nozzle at 20-inch spacing, your minimum boom height for getting 100% overlap, that means every part under the boom has a contribution of two nozzles. Your minimum boom height would be 14 inches. If you narrow that span to that nozzle spacing to 10 inches, you can go even lower. And now remember, the booms also sway, so you can't just go to that height. You have to allow for some movement and some contingency, I guess. The narrow spacings allow lower booms if the booms can in fact stay low, and that's the critical thing. It really draws attention to the fact that most of our suspended booms aren't very good at staying at a constant height. And there's a new sprayer called the Coarse sprayer, the Coarse leaf sprayer, that's arrived in Canada, and it has a sophisticated suspension system, and it's able to. If I step back from my thing, most
do the wave. Do the wave.
The center rack. Do you like this demo?
I like this.
They go up and down from the center rack. But the Coarse sprayer has another hinge point right here, so it can go up halfway out, and it can also go down halfway out. So it's a more contour following boom, and they claim that they can actually maintain a consistently low boom height. And I think there's a little bit of testing that's required here. But if that's true, that's one of the most powerful tools for reducing drift. And so the question asked that, and it's 100% correct. Can we reliably drive at our normal travel speeds, whatever they might be, and trust that the boom will stay at the 10 or 15-inch boom height that we've set it to? Let's see what the testing results are.
Okay, I'm going to throw one more at you because we're almost out of time. And boys, there's 20 more questions here that I could ask you. So good reason to attend Tech Talk Tuesdays coming up, because we can hopefully circle back to some of these. But final one from Dave Hooker. In what applications or environments should drift retardants be used?
Uh, let's both do this, Tom. So I'll start by saying I prefer to work with all the mechanical drift reducing technologies before I rely on any adjuvants. So droplet size, travel speed, boom height, picking your weather conditions if you have that luxury. I always say that adding adjuvants or treating the chemistry beyond what's already in the formulation is the absolute last step, and it should not be relied upon. It's an extra. It's not. It shouldn't ever be relied on as a make or break. What do you think, Tom?
I agree with you, and yet there are some, and there are some that are maybe trade named Interlock, for example, LS700. They are in fact capable of reducing the fine drop component over and above what the nozzle does. And so situations where this is necessary is if you've got a mix in the tank, you're committed to the job, you've got a certain nozzle and a certain droplet size spectrum, but you're not happy with the drift performance at that moment, you have no other alternative. You can certainly put material in that spray boom to reduce the fines, and those products do work, and they will reduce the fines probably 40 to 60% depending on the formulation type. So it's very significant. It's visually noticeable. It doesn't eliminate drift, but it helps.
It's funny you should say that, and we'll end with this. When we gave our talk, we mentioned that if you absolutely had to go to an ultra coarse or one of the larger droplet sizes, you are giving up some of the fines that we've been saying are very helpful in coverage. So, you are giving up potentially some coverage by using these products and spraying in those conditions. So I'll reiterate, if you have the luxury not to spray in those conditions or do anything else first, do that. Do check out Sprayers 101 for Tom's article coming up on boom height. It's almost too much for here. And our Micron Woman article and video talks a lot about coverage and how droplets behave. I think we would both encourage you to check that out too.